You're watching Force 13's live streaming service. Been watching Hurricane Delta for the whole of today, and it started today near the Cayman Islands as a Category 2 hurricane, or was it still a Category 1 even? Yes, Category 1 when I first woke up this morning, and now it's a Category 4 with winds of 140 miles per hour and a pressure around 956 millibars, and is almost halfway from the Cayman Islands to the Yucatan Peninsula. The storm is continuing to progress west-northwesterly, and a hurricane warning is in effect for the Yucatan. The storm could track very close to the significant population center that is Cancun, and landfall time, if it does make landfall, which is becoming increasingly likely, would probably occur in the early hours or maybe dawn hours of tomorrow morning. After that, it will proceed into the Gulf of Mexico and then deviate northwards, and then eventually make landfall somewhere along the US Gulf Coast. Quite where, we're not sure just yet. In this update, we'll be discussing obviously Delta's rapid intensification, which many people think is still ongoing. We'll have a discussion about that. Also, the National Hurricane Center will put out their next full advisory at the end of this hour, which we'll be there to cover for you. So, hang on for that one, and we'll see what they come up with at the next advisory. Probably not going to be huge change, given that there's not much recon evidence since they're not in there right now. But let's introduce the team. My name is Nathan Foy. I'm joined by quite a large team tonight. James, Amy, David, Kay, Orlando, Strat, and Yuxinator. Good evening to you all. Afternoon.
Good evening.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, it's been exhibiting some remarkable cloud tops for the Atlantic throughout today, with at times there has been a perfect ring of minus 82 degrees cloud tops all around the center of the storm. But what's missing is the apparent eye. Now, we've done a few checks, and on GOES East, which is the satellite that's located over the Atlantic, depicting that the storm's eye isn't really there from the satellite's perspective. GOES West, on the other hand, that's situated over the Pacific, has got more of an indentation, suggesting that some of us, certainly leading me to speculate at least, that because neither of those storms are directly over the storm and the eye is so small, that the eye might be much deeper than the satellites are depicting in the real world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible, based on what we're seeing. And recon, while not very close to the storm at the moment, will definitely give us a more clear picture of that when they get in there, hopefully within the next couple of hours now.
Let's get to the visible imagery. That's the latest visible, and you can see there, as always with intensifying systems, an arc of cloud tops that are just blowing along. It's a consistent motion there of just flaring up all day long.
That's something that I noticed with the thunderstorm activity, increasing, but going back to your previous imagery, I think there is a bit of an indicator that an eye could be there, but let's see what recon says. But
now,
it's a dangerous system.
Now, compared to earlier today, when this first became a Category 3, pressure is around 956 millibars. It's 956 again now as it becomes a Category 4, 140 miles an hour no less. Who wants to explain why the pressure's not been changing with the wind?
Well, that's happened because the eye has significantly contracted. since it's first formed. It formed earlier this morning, and it was 12 nautical miles or 14 statute miles at that time. It's now down to just 4 nautical miles or 5 statute miles. And as the eye has been contracting, it's been increasing its wind speeds in the same way that any spinning object will spin faster if you make it smaller, like an ice skater.
Gee. So, well, of course you can send in questions. Start your message with Force 13 all in text in the chat. We're very viewer orientated, and we take lots and lots of questions during this because it's quite important, especially people who are on the ground in the potential track of this storm. And a question there from Gary: how bad is this going to be in Tulum? That's on, I think, the edge of the hurricane warning zone still, is it? That's along the coast of Mexico, south of Playa del Carmen and Cozumel.
Yeah.
I
mean,
hurricane conditions possible.
Yeah. I mean, it's really going to be track dependent, unfortunately, with this system. You know, even at this point, if you're under a hurricane warning, and depending on your exact location, that municipality, of course, you know, as the description says, and as probably as a local official has been saying all day, is that any preparation should be rushed to completion imminently. They should be done before sundown tonight, as conditions will rapidly deteriorate overnight. But if we're talking about, you know, whether or not an area is going to get exactly hurricane force winds or the core of the storm, you know, that's still going to be very dependent on where it comes on shore exactly. You know, a little wobble can make a difference when you have a storm as compact as this one to what landmass might get hurricane force sustained winds up to major hurricane force to where it might just be getting tropical storm force winds instead. You know, that's a situation where a 10 to 20 mile deviation,
And that's really what
you're watching it very closely.
That's really what we're looking out for right now. And from what I saw earlier today, and I've not been keeping fully plugged into it, but the model's very tight-knit consensus now about the Yucatan landfall. That right?
That is right. Almost all of them have all of them have a landfall within a few miles of each other, very near to Cancun, which is unfortunately what we were hoping wouldn't happen. We were hoping it would move out to sea, but that seems unavoidable that it would impact Cancun now.
Yeah, but you know, where exactly it comes on shore, though, you know, if it comes on slightly north of Cancun to slightly south, of course, is going to end up making a difference, because that's a situation where right now models shifted to say it's going to make landfall just south of Cancun. That's going to put the northern side in the brunt of the hurricane force sustained winds. But, you know, it's a very small wind field, so extending to the northwest of the center is only 20 miles for hurricane force winds, 20 nautical miles.
Look on the NHC map, you wouldn't expect a wind field that small that you're seeing there to be a Category 4.
Their initial graphic, it's hardly you can hardly see the red indicating the hurricane force sustained winds, just because the radius of those winds are so small.
Very interesting. And they're depicting landfall will be around 7 or 8 a.m. Wednesday. That's Eastern time. So that's 6 or 7 a.m. Central time and Mexico time. So that seems about right. So good agreement with that. What there's much less agreement about is the U.S. landfall still.
And that could technically happen anywhere from Cameron, where Laura hits, over towards Mississippi and Alabama. Still.
Yeah. You know, I guess the thing to point out... Well, I guess the thing to point out most importantly, at least for U.S. impacts, is that while it's almost certain that there will be a strong hurricane making landfall somewhere along the central Gulf Coast, where exactly isn't very clear yet. And of course, when you're talking about a storm 4 days out, impacts can vary significantly based on that. The average tracker, of course, is about 160 miles or so 4 days out. So if you're in that area at all, just make sure you have your plan in place and are already taking some of the preliminary steps in case impacts become more likely for your exact location.
And from the US, this is around 4 days away, looking maybe a Saturday landfall.
Yep. I mean, the 11 a.m. cone was saying a very early Saturday landfall. By 8 a.m. it'd already be over.
Oh, really?
Louisiana, on their cone. Yeah, so they're saying probably around in between 2 to 6 a.m. that day. Although it will be accelerating at that point as well, so hopefully that means the storm is going to continue to clear out quicker at that point. Still a dangerous situation.
Yes, let's see if we've got some more questions just now. Oh, well, let's talk more about the eyewall structure. There's a question there about whether Delta's going through an eyewall replacement cycle.
I'm just looking at the microwave imagery of that now, and
Deep in thought there.
between earlier and now, there is a pronounced banding feature that has developed from the southwest through to the northeast. And while there's nothing present in the northwest of the storm, it could be the first signs of an Eyewall replacement cycle taking place. And were it to happen, it likely wouldn't take that long because of how small the original Eyewall is. It would die very quickly. But
Yes.
because it would die so quickly, first of all, the wind speeds in the outer Eyewall wouldn't be as strong, but it might be able to re-intensify to a similar peak nearest at landfall, where it's through the cycle now, because it's got enough time to. If the cycle were to take longer and happen later, then it might be quite weaker at landfall, which would probably be the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is that the cycle doesn't take place at all, and it keeps intensifying all the way up to landfall.
Yes. A question there off the back of that. Do you expect a new rapid intensification period soon? Even if it makes an eyewall replacement cycle, you think the answer might be yes?
It might not necessarily be rapid, because it would
Okay.
depend on the size of the new eyewall, but we could certainly see some renewed intensification once the cycle completed, if it were to happen.
When do we think Delta will turn? After landfall.
Yeah.
Yes.
Probably when it's back in the Gulf, actually. And why is it so small?
I mean, that's in part to do with the structures is developing. You know, we had a couple storms this year that originally developed with convection, completely displaced to the south and east of the center, despite, being tropical cyclones, and then had favorable conditions to organize better, those being Sally and Hannah. Those storms broadened out in size as convection wrapped all the way around the center and outflow expanded further out in the quadrants that initially didn't have as much coverage. Delta, on the other hand, actually lost its banding and focused its convection much more around the actual core of the storm. So if you were to take a look at the presentation of Delta 24 hours ago, you'd notice much more expansive banding and cloud cover and convective activity to the south and east of the center, with much less to the north and west. Now it's a much more symmetrical and powerful storm, but the actual size, at least in regards to convection and banding, has gone down significantly compared to what we were looking at yesterday.
Here's quite a simple question to answer. Do you think that Delta will be larger in size in the Gulf? It definitely will be. Landfall tends to do that to storms as well as latitude increases. And whether it will make landfall in Houston? Not likely.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's particularly likely to see a landfall that far west considering the current guidance envelope. That would have to go technically outside the cone. I will say the European model is on the western side of the envelope, and that's trying to bring a landfall closer to the Louisiana-Texas border. Right, actually almost an identical location to Laura's landfall in August if that model were to come true. But again, it is still important to reiterate that, the average track error this far out is about 160 miles or so, and it's too early to pin down an exact landfall location. So just make sure you're staying up to date and prepared.
And there again is the National Hurricane Center's cone. They're expecting landfall on the Yucatan early hours or around dawn on Wednesday, and then potentially a Category 2, maybe even pushing Category 3 landfall in the US, worst case scenario. Louisiana on Saturday early morning. Now, at the moment, it's got winds of 140 miles per hour, moving west-northwest at 16 miles per hour. Here's a question from me, whether it's still going south of the forecast or not. We've been monitoring that for quite a while, and when it was near Jamaica, it was doing so quite substantially, and that's why we're in this position now, from not having hurricane warnings in Cuba and having them in the Yucatan instead.
I think it's in the latest cone, it has slid slightly south of the forecast.
It has.
You can see because in the cone there's that little bend at the start.
Yes.
So we might see more significant impacts for Cozumel because of this latest trend.
And I mean, if you're talking about Cancun in particular as well, any little shift to the south is going to make a difference right now for them quite substantially because of the wind field size. If that trend really continues, then they might end up getting, more on the cusp of the most damaging winds that instead of ending up straight into the core of it. So, I mean, that's why we're keeping track of all these little deviations, even though the actual track is now much more set on a Yucatan Peninsula landfall.
I just saw a few questions there about the eye, and some people even not convinced that there even is an eye. There definitely is. Right at the center of the storm. It's very small. Satellites, slight trouble picking it up, especially since the satellite looks down at an angle. Very rarely do you get the storm forming directly below the satellite, as it were.
But also on microwave imagery, the eye is so small that you wouldn't really see it on there.
Right.
So it just looks, on microwave imagery, it just appears to be a strange blob in the middle of the storm. And if we hadn't had recon earlier, you wouldn't know that there was a pinhole eye in the middle of it.
But then, what I start to think then, how come we saw the eye of Wilma then?
Because Wilma was an incredibly strong storm and the microwave happened to hit it just right to catch it.
No, but the infrared had the very tiny eye when it formed. Is that just because its eye was better defined than this one is so far?
Wilma was further south from this, I believe, a little bit, and the satellite might be in position differently exactly.
Yeah, it'd probably be a mix of geographic positioning of the storm as well as the satellite, along with the definition of the actual eye itself.
Alright, well, enough of that speculation. Sea surface temperatures ahead of the storm are very warm indeed, around 29 or 30 degrees Celsius. Ocean heat content is about 50% higher than it was during Wilma. The 26 degree depth is about 50% higher as well. It's about 150 to 200 meters deep. That's 26 degrees Celsius waters compared to around 90 or 100 during Wilma. So it's certainly got conditions that are on par with Wilma's conditions atmospherically. And we had some questions earlier, or one or two, about whether we are thinking it's in more of a league with Wilma now compared to earlier today.
Well, since earlier today, it's become the fastest Atlantic hurricane on record to go from a tropical depression to Category 4 status. That puts it in a league of its own, and to be honest, that makes it at least a little bit comparable to Wilma.
Wow. Fancy us talking about that. Lots of people asking whether it will reach Category 5. Well, people seem to have that as the burning question that they come out with all the time, the first question. Whether it does or not, well, it's...
The latest HWRF run had it just barely getting to Category 5 status over open water and then weakening slightly before a very intense landfall in the Yucatan.
I can't see it not making landfall at peak.
Without an Eyewall replacement service.
Yeah, I suppose. That could happen.
I mean, whether or not it tries to get all the way up to that strength is really going to be mostly dependent on if it fights off the slight tilt with the anticyclone trying to come off of it a little bit, and then also whether or not it can just fight off an Eyewall replacement cycle properly. The atmospheric conditions are still very favorable ahead of it, although it does have some minor inhibitors in place right now, at least. There's a reason that it's potentially stalled off in intensification, although we don't really have recon data to say for sure. It was very surprising to see, at the end of this morning, the storm go from being a Category 2 to being a Category 3, which was, expected, and then have it only operationally be a Category 3 storm for 20 minutes before it was found out to be a Category 4 storm. I don't think you very often see a storm operationally jump 2 categories within a 20-minute time frame.
Gosh. Yeah, I can't think of any examples offhand. Kay, you were watching Recon earlier today and they were buzzing all around the storm. Tell us what they got towards the end of their runs and when the next one will be there.
Towards the end of their run, they got the statistics that went into the intermediate advisory, which was 120 knots and 956 millibars. After they got that, they left. But unfortunately, there's a large gap until the next reconnaissance into the storm arrives. It will be turning up around 7:30 Eastern time, which is still several hours from
3
now.
hours away.
And
Go ahead.
and all this is just adding to that how dangerous the storm is, and even though it's small, it will still have very small.
We're struggling with the signal there. Let's take some more questions. When do we think... we already answered when what Delta will turn, but we'll answer it again. It's after the Yucatan Peninsula, when it moves into the Gulf of Mexico. That's when it will turn towards the north, then the northeast eventually, just before landfall in the United States. How small do you believe that the pinhole eye is currently? And do you think that Delta's rate of intensification is similar to that of Charlie, Wilma, or another storm? We sort of touched on that already. And effectively, you said K from TD to Category 4 faster than Wilma.
Faster than any other Atlantic storm on record.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And I think for the question about the eye as well, earlier Recon, just correct me if I'm wrong, was saying around 6 miles for the eye, although it's possible based on...
They said 5 miles, 4 nautical miles, but to say what it would be now, 3 hours after Recon left, with the eye having been shown to be fluctuating during the Recon missions earlier, it would be pointless speculation to assume what it might be now. It could have gotten even smaller. It could have gone through a merger Eyewall replacement cycle and become bigger again, which would make it more stable and have a better time intensifying without disruption. It could be doing any number of things under that cloud top, and we'd have no idea without the recon. Really unfortunate timing, in my opinion.
Another question about what it is on the CDPS scale right now, the Cyclone Destruction Potential Scale. Shame Devon's not here to talk about it because he invented it. But I believe it's still a stage 6.
Yeah, and I do want to point out now that the storm looks to be resuming its intensification or rapid intensification, as there are suddenly a lot of new gravity waves.
Let's see. Again here on this imagery. The rapid scan 1 minute imagery from GO16. Not seeing much changing there, but still certainly maintaining its power.
Yeah. It's basically completely certain at this point we're probably going to see a very powerful landfall in the Cancun region, in between Cozumel and Cancun, most likely. At least Category 3. I mean, right now the expectations are for it to be a strong Category 4 storm at that point, and that's really what matters. There's a lot of questions, of course, if it'll resume quick intensification as it's done over the past 24 hours to a remarkable degree. Yesterday we were looking at 60 to 65 mile an hour storm at this time, and now we're at 140 miles an hour. It just goes to show the palpable danger that this thing really poses. to the land areas that'll be impacted. Fortunately, it's a small storm, so the worst impacts are going to be limited to a smaller land area, and because it does have some forward speed on it, it's going pretty sure at about 16 miles an hour. It won't be lingering around the longest to dump massive rainfall totals on top of what's already fallen from Gamma, although regionally there is another 4 to 6 inches of rainfall expected. Despite all of that, though, it's still, I think it was at least stage 6, and if it gets stronger beyond some expectations up to a stage 7, that really goes to show it is an extremely dangerous storm, and people need to be finishing their preparations on the Yucatan Peninsula imminently.
The issue with its fast-forward speed, however, is that it will maintain a lot of its momentum and intensity and carry that energy into the Gulf of Mexico, where it will become a bigger and more dangerous storm and move towards the Gulf Coast. And the intensity guidance has been gradually creeping closer and closer to a major landfall somewhere in Louisiana.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any saving grace for the U.S. Gulf Coast, at least, that combination of continental air, cooler sea surface temperatures, and increased shear expectations will at least weaken it down, most likely, from all consensus forecasts, from its current strength to something lower by the time it gets there.
National Hurricane Center will update in the next 30 minutes, we think, most likely. Sometimes they're early, sometimes they wait until the last minute, but their scheduled update will be at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Read out the latest information from their last advisory, though, whilst we're waiting for it. So, those who weren't aware at this point, the Cayman Islands, they're in the all clear. Tropical storm warning was discontinued. Hurricane warning for Tulum to Zilam, Mexico, and Cozumel. Tropical storm warning for Pinar del Rio in Cuba, the Isle of Youth, Punta Herrero to Tulum, and Zilam to Progreso in Mexico. And tropical storm watch for La Habana in Cuba as well. The key messages, which I thought were on this page, but they're not. Let me go get the key messages. Extremely dangerous storm surge and hurricane conditions are expected within portions of the northern Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico beginning tonight, and a hurricane warning is in effect. Heavy rainfall will affect portions of the Cayman Islands, western Cuba, and the northern Yucatan through midweek. This rainfall could lead to significant flash flooding and mudslides. The potential for heavy rain and flash flooding will increase along portions of the central Gulf Coast, Tennessee Valley, and southeastern U.S. as Delta moves inland later this week. And an increasing likelihood of life-threatening storm surge and dangerous hurricane-force winds, especially along the coasts of Louisiana and Mississippi beginning on Friday. Those areas yet again with storm surge issues potentially. Residents in these areas should ensure that they have their hurricane plan in place and monitor updates to the forecast. How many storms have threatened this part of the Gulf Coast now this year?
I think this would be the 4th? It's close to 5th, too.
There was Hannah, Laura, Sally, Beta. This would be the 5th significant storm.
What about Marco?
That's an insult to Marco.
Well, that's true. Is this the first time, because I can't remember the 2005 storms anymore, honestly. This must be the first time that 2 Greek names have threatened one location, though.
Yeah. It has to be, because there wasn't
What do you
ever a
think about
Greek
that
naming
one?
storm making landfall in the U.S. before. People don't necessarily, I guess because Beta made landfall in Texas, a lot of people forget that it did dump a lot of rainfall over southern Louisiana before it came on shore, and then came back over and gave more rainfall again.
Just thinking of 2005, Beta and Gamma were sort of the same area.
They produced rainfall in the same area, but that's
Yeah.
not necessarily impacting.
Yeah. Interesting one. But there we have it.
I mean, the storms out to sea formed in a similar place, but there isn't any land to be affected out there.
More questions just now. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate Delta's structure?
That's $1 million question. We pretty much have nothing but speculation based on what we know from the last recon mission until the next one gets in there. Unless an eye magically appears on satellite or we get a clear microwave showing a different picture.
Well, think about it. It's a category 4. There's 5 categories. That suggests maybe 8 out of 10.
I guess that's a way to put it.
Yeah.
That's certainly what Sateed is giving it anyway.
Yeah, interestingly enough about the structure, I was looking and I seem to have found some imagery, both microwave and radar, that may indicate a very short Eyewall replacement cycle process that may have occurred.
Now,
that
something
might
that's already
See-
happened or currently ongoing.
Already happened.
It's possible that it's already happened or just completing based on imagery.
Which would explain why it didn't intensify.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the frustrating thing right now is because, we're in a gap of, the last plane left was around 12 p.m. today or so, closer to 1. So we're going to have a gap of around 6 to 7 hours where there's no data, and the best you can really do is eyeball it with satellite estimates. The issue is, though, is that because the system's so small and the eye's so small, it's hard to get a really good read on that. So it's really a lot going on prior data and then waiting in to see what the new data has when reconnaissance aircraft comes in. I think an interesting note, though, is that one of the NOAA buoys out there is about to go straight under the center of the storm or near the center of the storm. So that could be a good indicator of some of the information regarding the storm when that data comes in. But at least in terms of flight pattern information, we're not going to have some of that for at least a couple more hours, unfortunately.
Checking the rapid scan again. Noticing 1 or 2 little points of interest, perhaps. Just checking closely here on this imagery. Not much to tell from that, but we'll keep monitoring it. Of course, as soon as the advisories come in from the National Hurricane Center, of course, it's not just Delta's update that we're looking out for, although it has just come out. They are going with 145 miles per hour with a pressure of 956 millibars, and they are calling for 155 miles per hour at landfall effectively. That's what we've been saying for most of the day, and a secondary peak at 130 miles per hour.
Yep.
So that's the breaking news here right now, up to 145 miles per hour.
I mean, that really emphasizes the danger for the Yucatan Peninsula here near Cancun. I think everyone here knows at this point, even though, a lot of media and coverage talk really hammers on the difference between a category 4 and 5, that the difference between 155 miles an hour and 160 does not really mean much when you're in the path of that storm. It's very minimal, both in total impacts and, how you really should be preparing. So people there really do need to be completing all the preparations now within the next couple hours. Everything should be done by night, because by the time you wake up, this storm's going to be bearing down on you completely. And if you have been giving evacuation orders, which have been put in place for parts of Cancun, Puerto Morelos, Isla Holbox, and some other coastal areas in the Quintana Roo state, make sure you're paying attention to those and heeding those now. There are some shelters in place if you need those, and there's, of course, other plans that you can also make just to get out to safer locations during the storm.
Just a small change in the watches and warnings. The tropical storm watch for La Habana has been discontinued. So they're still running with a pressure of 956, eye diameter of 5 nautical miles, winds of 145 miles per hour gusting to 175, and its wind radius 90 nautical miles northeast for tropical storm conditions, 80 southeast, 60 southwest, 80 northwest, and the storm still moving west-northwest at 15 knots. Now, trying to plug in the data points here, they have it, trying to figure this out. 20.2 north, 86.1 degrees west is where they have the peak intensity, which puts that off Cozumel, actually, if I'm not mistaken. Looks like it could... Nope, just checking this. Looks to me as though... I don't know yet because the track hasn't come out and I'm just trying to plug the numbers, but I think it's now trending closer towards Cozumel than to Cancun.
Yeah, I mean, based on the southern deviations in track that we've been seeing continue over the past day, definitely not surprising. If it really comes all the way down to Cozumel and then moves into Playa del Carmen instead, you might be in a situation where Cancun can try to barely skirt out of hurricane force winds, or at least the major hurricane force winds at that point, if it really comes that far down south. You know,
I can confirm that the forecast advisory seems to indicate a landfall that might just clip the northern tip of Cozumel before making landfall between Playa del Carmen and Puerto Morelos.
So I'm really wondering what that might mean for the later track as well, whether that's moved.
Yep.
That
That's
would
going
mean
to
a
have
lot
to
more
have
time over.
implications.
It would be a lot more time over land, and they're actually showing more weakening because of it. They show it weakening down to a category 120, so they show 20 knots of weakening over land, and then they show it strengthening. There's now 2 category 4 points in the Gulf of Mexico, but they still want 130 knot secondary peak.
For 130 miles an hour secondary peak. Just for those who are interested, this is the Eastern Pacific right now. I'm sure not many people are interested at all, but the updates have come out from the National Hurricane Center on the 2 storms that are still there. Somehow, and I'm struggling to explain it, but Marie is still a tropical storm with 40-mile-an-hour winds. I've seen them deactivate storms that look a lot better than that. Marie's in the middle of your picture. And on the very far right-hand side, near the edge, is Norbert, which is now 50 miles per hour and a pressure of 1001. Shouldn't be affecting land, but it's not going to move very much over the next 5 days. So that's just a quick glance at the Eastern Pacific.
Yeah, and I just wanted to give a mention to Delta really quick, at least for the difference between Playa del Carmen and Cancun. If the center of this system goes across Playa del Carmen, that's about in between 35 to 40 miles from Cancun. Well, at least the center of Cancun. The very edge of Cancun would be closer to 30 miles away. If you're talking about the current hurricane wind radius on the northwestern quadrant, it's about a little over 20 miles. And on the northeastern quadrant, a little over 30 miles. Those would be the parts closest to Cancun. So if that trend really continues, then you might be seeing a much stronger impact for Playa del Carmen and Cozumel, and Cancun potentially just escaping hurricane force sustained winds.
Very interesting information in the discussion.
Okay.
I do want to mention right now that there are top towers now flaring around the Eyewall on all sides of the storm except for the north.
That would be indicative of intensification. But in the discussion, they say that there is no evidence of an outer eyewall from the aircraft reports earlier or radar imagery from Grand Cayman. As a result, they don't believe an eyewall replacement cycle is likely, and they expect additional strengthening to occur. The NHC intensity forecast is once again above the intensity aids until landfall. They expect a secondary peak in the Gulf of Mexico in 48 to 60 hours. After that time, they expect a reduction in wind speed, but a significant increase in the size of the wind field, resulting in a significant storm surge and wind event for portions of the northern Gulf Coast later this week. And that's their exact wording.
Well, ain't that wonderful?
Regardless of their final landfall intensity.
And the track forecast has shifted west slightly. This is the brand new track forecast, and well, the area that Laura made landfall, that's in the cone. That's not a huge distance from the center of the cone. The center of the cone is over west central Louisiana. The landfall location, first of all, in Mexico there. Cozumel very much in the cone. Cancun on the edge of the cone. The storm itself, the first major point there, that's where they expect it to be 155 miles per hour. So that's not entirely at landfall, so that opens up speculation that maybe it will reach Category 5 status before striking land. And then the weakening process, and then the enlargement of the storm.
Yeah, I mean, that really changes the way a lot of coverage is going to have to come into, or at least, preparations for people there. Because right now we're talking about, this is, a very strong Category 4 storm, but its wind field is so small that Cancun now possibly might miss hurricane force sustained winds. But then for the Gulf Coast, just a couple days later, we're looking at a circumstance where, the whole state of, Louisiana could potentially get, or at least on the coastal side, could get tropical storm force winds based on that landfall cone with a much wider expected hurricane force wind field as well. And like they said, that's increasing the risk for more widespread storm surge along the Gulf Coast too.
I would like to note for people in Mexico that the latest cone shows a direct landfall in Puerto Morelos, which is about 20 miles south of Cancun, 20 to 25 miles.
Yep, 21 miles south, Playa del Carmen, 18 miles southwest of there as well.
I also want to point out that that final point before landfall in the United States, they have that as a high-end Category 3 hurricane.
Yes. I mean, yeah, well, are they calling for a Category 3 landfall then?
It's
I think
hard
they're
to tell.
leaving
Makes the
it as a
question.
borderline case because they're not that certain themselves.
Yeah,
Which is
I mean,
fair enough.
But,
I'd say
you know,
Category 2 maybe 115 if you're unlucky.
if it follows the western edge of that cone, though, even just for the first 2 days of that, or 2.5 days of that cone, makes a massive difference because sea surface temperatures are much warmer over there, haven't been upwelled by Laura or Sally. So if it did deviate further west, and it's been doing that the whole time, I got to say so far, then not only would it put Texas into play, but also maybe even still a stronger storm.
yeah. I mean, based on the 5 p.m. positioning and intensity guidance, I mean, they are saying 125 miles at that 72-hour point, which is quite close to land. Based on the expectations for the increase in shear, cooler sea surface temperatures at that area alongside continental air mass, which model's been projecting to try to entrain itself near the end too. I mean, it's hard to say, but it definitely raises the possibility for that. Although I think the National Hurricane Center is kind of going out of their way not to really specify whether or not they're saying such a thing will happen in their discussion, and instead focusing much more on now the expectation that more land interaction will broaden out the storm more and increase the risk for a much larger storm to bring widespread impacts to a larger area than prior expectations.
Now that it's
Well, they
likely
said
to
that
move...
The reasoning
I'm
The
sorry.
reasoning for their change in impacts to the US is not necessarily the land impacts, it's a development from the global models. That's what they cited. They said the global models now indicated that it would undergo some sort of extratropical process, perhaps, that would cause the wind field to broaden significantly.
Now that it's likely, though, to move further over the Yucatan than what we were initially expecting, that does suggest, well, first of all, it's still not near enough at this storm's forward movement speed to weaken it substantially, like numerous categories rather than just maybe one or maybe two if we're lucky. But then obviously the storm's going to be bigger on the other side and more larger because it is going over more land.
Yeah. I mean, definitely true. Part due to this dry air entrainment that's kind of forecast. Models are really trying to dig into a significant mass of dry air, and I think this is from the trough that's actually supposed to be kicking it off to the north and east as well at a quicker pace once it moves inland. They're expecting that drier air from that will try to wrap around towards the core while it's still in the Gulf of Mexico significantly before landfall. That could contribute to it not really looking like the most typical hurricane when coming on shore if that really plays out, although really time to see if those model trends hold up for sure rather than just being a couple run deviation.
On the imagery here, you can see towards the southern side of the eye more blow-ups there. That's roughly a semicircle of minus 85 degree cloud tops on the southern side. At least at this moment.
Well, not that long ago, we saw a burst of minus 90 cloud tops, even getting towards minus 95.
Yes, there was a small area of that, but this is a much larger area than I've seen all day having that kind of cloud tops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can take some questions then. If you've missed it, the National Hurricane Center came out with the advisory, very early actually, about 25 to, saying that this is now 145 miles per hour, Category 4 hurricane. Pressure still 956. And a question
The pressure's almost certainly lower, but they
Yeah.
don't have any reasonable evidence to lower it, so they're just keeping it there as an operational process.
And a question that's just come in there is the National Hurricane Center says Greek names won't be retired. Could this change their minds?
I saw a post from a National Weather Service office earlier, and they said that it would be retired as Delta 2020, but then Delta would be reused again.
This can't be sustainable.
I don't think so. I think something will happen in next year's World Meteorological Organization conference, and
Assuming they have
they
one.
might. Well, when they have a meeting to discuss this season, they're going to have to do something about the usage of Greek names.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's still more of a wait and see right now. You know, they had the whole discussion in 2005 when this happened for the first time, and they came up with, oh, we'll retire the name, you know, let's just use a random example. It doesn't actually exist, you know, hypothetical. You know, they'll retire Alpha 2002, and they just reuse Alpha if it ever has to be used again. You know, that doesn't really sound like it makes the most sense up front, but I mean, that's, you know, their protocol for it. So, I mean, they might end up coming back to try to reevaluate it in the future, but I mean, right now, at least, you know, we really shouldn't be trying to focus too much on, oh, you know, are they going to retire this system or do something with it ahead of time, as much as making sure that we have,
Well,
you know, full information on all the impacts.
considering the National Weather Service did mention it, I suppose it is worth mentioning here as well.
It's true.
Plenty more questions, though. Is it possible for the hurricane to hit Texas? Yes.
It's within the cone.
It is indeed
So
within the
that's
cone.
yeah. And the NHC has been stressing in every discussion that the average forecast error is 150 miles at day 4, and on average, a storm will leave the cone 1 in 3 times. So
1 in 3.
it's definitely possible.
Tropical Weather Updated says, not related, but was there evidence of a Category 3 Paulette?
No.
No.
I don't think so.
I actually got something to share as well, because I was talking, you know, Kay was talking about the wind field expansion. Kay, you were mentioning the forecast discussion describes some sort of post-tropical transition. There's the GFS's 12Z model run for relative humidity kind of gives a good indication of that. If you want to pull up my screen really quick just to show this.
Oh, what's this just now? Just a moment. Let's get that here. And naturally, it's running slowly, so whilst I wait for that to load up, more questions. What is the current season ACE? Accumulated cyclone energy.
I can get that up for you in just a moment. We have a link on our Discord page and our resources.
Will
Take you
Delta
straight to it.
slow down or stop intensifying soon? We hope so, but we probably don't think so.
The current ACE for the season is 108.4. For Delta, it was hold on. The current ACE is 109.1, and Delta's already at 4 ACE. So Delta's going to definitely be a significant ACE producer this season, and we'll probably get above 120 before long.
Ready for you now, Strat.
Alright, so I just want to show this, and I want Kay's comments on it too, because you were reading the forecast discussion earlier. I think this is what they were alluding to when they're saying, you know, that broadening it out, you know, might be in some regards towards a level of post-tropical transition, because this is the relative humidity, so, you know, atmospheric moisture in the atmosphere. You look and you can see, at least initially, hour 42 from 12Z, so this is 2 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday. Very moist around the storm, but if you go to hour 66, or let's go 72, which would be 8 a.m. on Friday, you see this envelope of dry air come around and completely cut off the southern side, and then you have that comma shape with moisture, with the shield of rainfall and general moisture expanding towards the northwest side of the center, which is kind of what you see happen with a lot of systems as they turn post-tropical or try to begin that transition. By the time you get to hour 84 and the storm's coming on shore, it's even more apparent because the whole southern half is just filled in with dry air on this GFS run, and the whole northern half, particularly the northwestern side, is the most prevalent with the remaining thunderstorm and rainfall activity at that point, with extensions coming off way to the north and east of the center due to wind shear at that point, stripping off convection as well. So, I mean, a strong point that Kay was making there from the forecast discussion, and based on some of the computer runs that we're seeing, very valid to say so as well.
Fascinating.
Yeah, the wind speed isn't going to be the deciding factor. When this hits the US, it's going to be a storm surge, and then as it dies out, an inland rainfall event. But
another one.
Not one to focus on the wind speeds for.
Yeah, I think if we're looking at a storm like this, I think our coverage on Teddy is somewhat relevant here, despite how crazy that sounds, because you're talking about if something like this occurs, you're going to have significant areas potentially that might not have any significant rainfall or very light rainfall, but still have significant time periods of damaging sustained winds. And then you're also going to have a much wider potential area of storm surge impacts. And those are things that they are noting down in their forecast discussion as well. So definitely keep an eye out for this once the storm emerges back into the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, the main focus right now is on the Yucatan. But if you're in the U.S. and trying to plan out how to prepare for this system, developments like this will be relevant.
Indeed. More questions then here. Why doesn't Delta have a clear eye yet?
Because the eye is so small, it's struggling to break through its own convection, which is, I wouldn't be, I'm very surprised at how intense the convection is and it's going to be frank. I haven't seen anything like it in the Atlantic basin.
I must say that very latest satellite frame looks rather foreboding there. Really wrapping round the southern semicircle. Minus 86s generally now on the whole south side.
It's just going up and up and up with the CDO presentation. I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with a ring of minus 90s.
God. And this is the Atlantic. We don't get things like that. Dorian, for perspective, 185 mile an hour, category 5, and barely minus 70s.
Yeah, I think, that gives a really good point about how atypical something like this is. If you want another really famous example, would be Irma, when they were assuming it was a moderate category 4 storm because it barely had minus 60 rings with tiny bits of minus 70 around it, and then they come and say it's 175 miles an hour. It's not very common at all.
Are you sort of dreading what Recon are going to say later tonight then?
I mean,
well, no,
I'm definitely not looking forward to it.
Recon was in it earlier, so we know that it's not going to be that ridiculously off. Because it's not the first time Recon goes in.
But how much of a gap is this now?
It's going to be about 6
hour
hours.
Gap.
A 6 hour gap, a lot can happen in that time.
Yeah.
With an eye this size, it could be a category 5 when Recon goes in. If the eye's still there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in general it is foreboding to see such consistent cloud tops like this, because this isn't like a random new occurrence that's just popped up and is fading away. We've seen minus 80 cloud top rings sustained very consistently. I think the coldest cloud top Isaac said measured by satellite earlier today was minus 93 temporarily. A lot of this has been sustained for most of today. So, I mean, it's a very negative thing.
I think we had a minus 95 earlier.
I mean, it goes to the point. What's the record for the coldest cloud top for a hurricane?
Oh, I don't know.
I guess because typically when we're looking for tropical cycles as a whole, you're like, oh, look at the Eastern Pacific or Western Pacific for a very sheared storm, or even the South Pacific. You're not really looking for the Atlantic to see minus 90s, not from shear, but just really strong organizational efforts.
I mean, some of the big storms, especially further south, like Joan, Miriam in 1988, might be a contender.
Yeah. Have to look into that later for sure.
Who was just about to speak there?
was, we have some news for the Alabama coastline. The governor has issued a mandatory evacuation for tourists and visitors along the Alabama Gulf Coast starting tomorrow morning.
So there's the first messaging already from the authorities about evacuations along the US Gulf Coast again.
It seems like Alabama isn't taking any chances
Yes.
after they've been hit by Sally.
Yeah. And I will say, another thing that's come in as well is the first rainfall graphics from the Weather Prediction Center are out. I'll copy this image and throw it into the chat for you to get it out here really quick. But this is the first Weather Prediction Center graphic, and they're indicating a maximum expectation of 4 to 6 inches of rainfall in Louisiana, or 6 to 10 inches, I'm sorry, with 4 to 6 inches of rainfall extending through most of Louisiana and into significant portions of Mississippi as well. So they're not expecting this to be nearly as significant of a rainmaker as Sally was, of course, for Alabama and Florida and other portions of the Gulf Coast, or even Laura, which did have a significant area of 10 to 15 inches of rain. But, I mean, that really just goes to underscore the other threats that the storm could be potentially bringing down the line as well.
Fingers crossed those rain estimates won't increase like they have with previous storms. Just because this storm, I'm optimistic about that, because this storm doesn't look like it's going to slow down anywhere.
No, and that dry air entrainment as well, if the models are right about that, will limit the amount of rainfall coming in from the southern side after the storm makes landfall, begins to move inland. It'll really cut off its ability to draw more moisture and create banding features that extend into the Gulf of Mexico and come on shore even after the storm's moving inland. So, I mean, those are going to be a mix of reasons to why you see a lower initial rainfall forecast. Hopefully that drops off more, kind of like what we saw with Beta when it was having its forecast continuously dropped off.
More questions here. Let's see if I can get any.
Some
yes,
news
go ahead.
that's coming in is that the entire Cancun hotel zone on the coast has been evacuated to shelters inland,
That doesn't surprise me either.
and that's mandatory. The hotels are shut.
I mean, they definitely can't
Wise
be
thing
taking any
to do.
chances with this.
So all the storm chasers are being a bit upset because their plans have been disrupted.
Well, there is a storm coming, and no, the hotels won't be taking any chances on this. Let's see,
I
what
mean-
else have we got here? Could Delta reach 200 miles an hour like Patricia?
It would be very rash of anyone to predict a peak intensity that's 10 knots above the record for the basin,
Yeah.
which was Allen, and that was an exceptional storm, and it may not even have been that strong.
Yeah, I mean, something very important to keep in mind, if you're talking about that would mean, an increase of 55 miles an hour sustained in the next about 12 hours or so, 12 to 15 hours before this thing makes landfall. This thing doesn't have another 2 to 3 days over insanely favorable conditions where it could continue to ramp up and then have the odds of either no Eyewall replacement cycle coming in or going through one and then coming up again. It's got less than a day, barely over half a day before it actually makes landfall. So while it can ramp up significantly still in that time period and potentially become a Category 5 storm, to see something into those upper echelons in the remaining time frame that it has left before it reaches significant disruptions due to land interaction would be definitely, as Kay said, rash to say.
And on that note, we'll be finishing up now. This was an hour discussion on Force 13 Live with myself, Nathan Foy, and the team. We're not abandoning anyone, though. We will be covering this storm immensely over the course of tonight and tomorrow on the Force 13 channel. You can stay up to date on our social platforms and on our YouTube channel. That's where all the new videos will be coming out. I think we'll be on for a tropical weather bulletin in 3 hours time, I'm sorry. So that's probably going to be our next video. And then this storm looks like it's going to make landfall early tomorrow morning local time, and we'll be there for it. with more live coverage. Don't know what time just yet, but you'll see an announcement all across our platforms. And you can also keep up with the conversation on our Discord server as well. You can chat there. Very large community now, well, growing still. Discord.gg/Force13 if you want to take part. But that's it from us. Thanks very much to the team for taking part tonight and giving us their thoughts. And we'll be back some point soon. Time's getting pretty short now for the Yucatan Peninsula as the storm Delta, Hurricane Delta, moves closer. Now predicting a 155 mile an hour peak just short of the Yucatan Peninsula, and Category 5 can't be ruled out. That's all for now. We'll see you again soon. Good night.